Chapter 3. Election and predestination of Jacob. That the purpose of the election might stand. Romans 9:11. And the Lord said unto her, Two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. General 25:32. The Calvinist misinterpretation and view of the 25th chapter of Genesis, as quoted by the Apostle Paul in Romans 9:11, is the heart and root of the doctrine of unconditional election. It is from their misreading of this passage that they guess, if God predestined, chose, elected Jacob over Esau before they were born, to an unchangeable destiny, then the same must be true about God selecting individuals to go to heaven or to hell, God electing them before they are born. They figured, just like the destinies of Jacob and Esau, that the eternal destiny of each individual in the world is unchangeable too. This is the root premises of the unconditional election doctrine. In this chapter, I present well-researched and valid reasons why we can safely say that this doctrine is unbiblical, not the context of the passage, hermeneutically inaccurate, and is only based on philosophical theory which is not found in the scripture. In this chapter, I present the discussion of 5 points, reasons why Calvin's unconditional election doctrine is not what Gen 25:32 teaches. What was said to Rebekah about Esau and Jacob was not personally about them as individuals, but rather was pertaining to them as nations and branches of the patriarchal family of Abraham. The election of Jacob was not an election to eternal salvation, but as the progenitor of the nation family of Israel through which Christ the Messiah would come. The covenants, promises and revelations from God to the patriarchs, in that era, did not include knowledge of personal eternal salvation. Thus, a discussion of individuals being predestined to heaven or to hell was not within the scope of the degree of their revelation, nor God's intended message to Rebekah. The message given to Rebekah in Genesis 25:32 was not pertaining to the whole world then. It was absolutely exclusive to the Hebrews, Abraham's seed. It was strictly relative to the continuation of the lineage of Abraham to Jesus via the line of Jacob. The passage story is about the history of the patriarchs and their place in the purpose of God as the fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob of the chosen people, Israel. By presenting these 5 points in this chapter, I intend to make it clear that Genesis 25:32 is not referring to personal salvation or reprobation of individuals. Nor is it a template for God's election of individuals to personal salvation or reprobation, as erroneously taught in Calvinism. Chapter objective: to answer the following questions and to articulate an answer to the question, is Genesis 25:23-26 teaching about the eternal salvation or reprobation of all the people in the whole human race? Is that thought even applicable to this passage in any way? 1. What is meant by the purpose of God according to the election in Romans 9:11? Is it about individual salvation? 2. Did God mention anything to Rebekah about Esau going to hell, or Jacob going to heaven in the passage? 3. The events of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, mentioned by Paul in Romans 9, took place in the dispensation of promise. Were they events that taught personal salvation as prototypes of God's plan for the eternal salvation or reprobation of all the individuals in the human race? 4. Is it hermeneutically accurate to categorize these passages Romans 9:11 and Gen 25:32 as a personal salvation passages, pertaining to the eternal destinies of all individuals? 5. During his earthly ministry, did Jesus say anything about the Esau and Jacob scenario that would tell us that we have already been predestined to heaven or hell before we were born? 6. Is the reference to Jacob and Esau about them personally as pertaining to them individuals, or was it about them as nations born to the patriarchal family of Abraham and Isaac? 7. What nation was born out of the election of Jacob, Rebekah's womb? Gen 25:32, Romans 9:11. 8. What was significant about Jacob's election? Essence of the unconditional election doctrine. Calvinist perspective. This passage was taken out of context by St. Augustine, to be a proof text that taught that man was so badly damaged by the fall of Adam. Augustine's doctrine of original sin, that he is in a state of total depravity. This doctrine holds that man does not have the will to choose good nor to choose to be saved from eternal reprobation. God, seeing this total depravity, decided that he was going to fix the whole thing, by choosing salvation or reprobation for every man, before they are born. Thus, he predestines some men to heaven and some to hell before they are born. This is the essence of Augustinian Calvinism's concept of predestination. Genesis 25:32 is very venerable to the misinterpretation of Calvinists because on the surface, without research, its wording sounds like it's teaching unconditional election and predestination. That's why Augustine misused it for that purpose. What Calvinists mistakenly think about this passage is that this must be the way God chooses man to be saved because they cannot come to God on their own free will. According to Calvin, man is totally depraved, and therefore, unable to choose to come on his own. The main point of the argument of the Calvinist is that man has no free will. Therefore, the Calvinist used the predestination theory to answer the question, having no free will and thus, being totally depraved, how do men who are saved, get saved? The philosophical assumption presumed in answering that question is, that there has to be something done in man or on behalf of man to save him, since he has no free will. Out of this dilemma, the concept of election and predestination was made and placed by Augustine into philosophical theology. This was the brainchild of St. Augustine when he was under pressure to explain how his doctrine of original sin and the inability of man worked in how men are saved from reprobation. To answer that, Augustine referred to Genesis 25:32, which is unrelated to personal salvation in that respect. He illegitimately claimed that his theory is taught from that passage. However, any honest Bible student can very clearly see that this passage is not pertaining to that at all. Calvinists don't want to hear that because uncovering this fact is detrimental to the very core of Calvinism. Because if God is not speaking about the eternal destinies of the whole human race, some to salvation and the others to reprobation, in this passage Gen 25:31, then their doctrine is false. The apostolic response to the Calvinist perspective of Romans chapter 9. The predestination of Jacob is not teaching, nor is it an example of the predestination of the whole human race, to eternal salvation or reprobation. Augustinism fogs our view of true revelation. Before Augustine AD 33 to 380, the Church viewed the passage just as it is explained here in this book. It can only be seen that way without the distraction of Augustine's philosophical theories blocking our view of Paul's meaning in the passage. If we read this passage without the distracting delusion of the mystical doom of Calvinism looming in the background, it is clear as day what the apostle is saying in Romans 9, as he refers to Gen 25:32. He is actually teaching the gospel of the coming Messiah through the generations of Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. God's announcement to Rebekah, that two nations were in her womb, one being the nation through which the Messiah will come, was extremely significant. It was significant to her to know what God was doing in her for the sake of his purpose. In this, she was like Mary, Hannah, and Elizabeth, who all bore special sons. The lineage of Abraham continued in Jacob. It was a vital part of the continuity of the plan of God, down through the lines of Abraham. The message was pertaining to where in the patriarchal lineup, her son, S, would be positioned and how that positioning is vital to God's planned final objective, for Israel. The birth of the child of promise, Jacob, was in the plan of the lineage of Abraham. This lineage goes all the way to Jesus. It is the line that comes down from Adam through Abraham. It is the seed of the earth blesser. Through thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Genesis 11:18.
We have just studied the unconditional election theory of Augustine and Calvin to show where it came from. It came from the misreferencing of Genesis 25:32 and Romans 9:11, two passages which have nothing to do with personal salvation or eternal destinies were misused to teach Augustine's theory of predestination. These passages are about the lineage of Israel, Abrahamic lineage, in the dispensation of promise, which had nothing to do with personal salvation. Stay tuned for the next lesson on Calvin.